Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome into this space. We're so glad you are joining us tonight for our For the People Act, For People of Faith webinar. My name is Reverend Katie Sexton Wood, and I have the great honor of serving as Executive Director of the Arizona Faith Network, and also an ordained pastor in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. As we are still having folks join us tonight, we want to go ahead and invite you to introduce yourself in the chat to everyone, to click the panelists and attendees. Or if you're joining us on Facebook, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the comments. Share with us your name, your faith tradition, and where in Arizona or across the nation you are joining us tonight. We are so very honored to be partnering with Faithful Democracy and the African American Christian Clergy Coalition in our organizing efforts around protecting voters' rights. With that, I want to introduce and hand the microphone over to the phenomenal Dr. Janice Scott, who is going to set our evening up for us tonight, as well as kick us off with a prayer.
Well, thank you, Reverend Katie, and thanks to everybody who's listening in. We too are honored to be here with Arizona Faith Network, a strong partner and really the premier organization for both ecumenical and interfaith work in the state of Arizona. We are also grateful to be here with our colleagues from Faithful Democracy, as well as so many others who are as concerned about what's happening with voting rights in Arizona as we are. We want to thank Public Citizen for their support of this work in Arizona, and just really want to lock arms with all of you who are fighting for voters' rights. This is so important in this day and time, and African American Christian Clergy Coalition stands ready to speak out prophetically on this issue, as well as to do the action that it's going to take to make sure that everyone who has the right to vote does get the right to vote. So thank you again, Katie. And I just want to also honor my colleagues from the Muslim religion who around the world are now still in the month of Ramadan. Let me say Ramadan Mubarak. I know we're coming up on Eid, but we're so grateful to our colleagues of all the faith traditions, and especially our Muslim brothers and sisters tonight. For those of you who may be about to break the fast, we hope that you will continue to be able to join us through this evening. So let us pray. Most gracious and kind God, how we thank you for giving us a prophetic voice to speak, for giving us hearts of compassion and hearts of justice, for giving us the ability to lock hands with our brothers and sisters of faith and of the secular world. We thank you, God, that you are concerned about the affairs of man. And we thank you that you are in the midst. No matter what it looks like, we trust you for the answers. We thank you, God, for those who will speak tonight. Let their words be a blessing to those who hear, and let us be activated to be more involved civically so that people do not end up being treated unjustly. We thank and praise you for it. And I pray this in the name of my loving Savior, Jesus Christ. Isa to the Muslim, Yeshua to the Jew, Jesus to me. Thank you. God bless you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Aubrey Barnwell, who is the Director of Operations with the African American Christian Clergy Coalition. He will be framing our evening tonight with a biblical framework of justice, and as it relates to this particular issue, then he will facilitate the rest of the event. Pastor Aubrey?
Bless you all. Thank you all for joining us. We're so blessed to have this opportunity to share. I want to begin framing this from a biblical context. I'm going to take us in a different, direction, if you will. In Matthew chapter 25, about verse 14, there's a story of a master who gives out talents to his servants, and he gives one 5, and he gives another 10, and he gives another one 1. And they are to take their talents and they're to use those talents and to invest them. We find that the master goes away and he comes back. And when he returns, one has buried it, one has invested it, and another one has multiplied it. As I thought about this account of Jesus identifying what the kingdom of heaven is like, one of the things that I thought about was in regards to our ability to vote. And the talent is used in one translation. It's also used as a bag of gold in another translation. When we think about a talent, our ability to vote, our ability to make our desires known through voting is being stolen. That it's being taken away, it's being robbed, we're being robbed of it. And so one of the things that was placed in my spirit is that we should stop the steal, stop the stealing. We recognize that they're trying to rob us of our ability to actually cast our votes. And what we do with our votes, what we are able to do with them, whether you are on the left or on the right, the ability to actually cast your vote is a talent. It's an ability it's an empowerment to be able to bring about the desire that you have collectively, individually. And so as we think about what our responsibility is, Jesus in his stance said that, listen, I've came to set the captives free, those who have been robbed of the ability to function, those who have been robbed of the ability to the right to be able to voice their opinion. So he identified that. And then this specific text that I've identified in Matthew chapter 25:14, it says that there was a fear, there can be a fear of accountability. There's a fear of a nullification of our ability to actually use what we've been given. But we need to move past our fear and be able to recognize that we have been given the ability to actually make a difference, that we can actually use the talent that we have been given, and we will not be robbed of it, and that we will do everything we can to hold fast to that. So what we identify is give us the ballot, give us the ability to make our voices known. And so we will do that tonight. We'll talk about how the steal is trying to take place. Right now, we'll be given a high-level overview from Sister Quincy Howard. Sister Quincy Howard.
Hi there. Thank you so much. And thank you for that frame that is quite powerful and appropriate for the kinds of issues that we're all facing together. So I am really honored to be here tonight. The African American Christian Clergy Coalition and the Arizona Faith Network are phenomenal partners that inspire me. Their engagement and enthusiasm and passion as they come to these issues is what keeps me going. So I was asked to join tonight to try to give a high-level overview of what is in the For the People Act as a federal legislation. So bear with me, it is a massive bill. The way that I like to describe S1 or HR1 in the House, it's the first priority for the 117th legislative session. And it is a bold, comprehensive, transformational omnibus bill. I think of it as like the ACA of democracy. And it would taken as a whole, it would make our democracy more inclusive. It would make it more fair. It would make it more representative. It would hold our elected officials more accountable. And it would really make it truer to the ideals that were laid out by our founders. The US has never lived up to these ideals, but I think that the For the People Act would get us a lot closer to being true to that vision. So I'm going to talk about the bill as sort of three areas of reform, all of which work together in tandem to try to fix our democracy. The first title is really the one that is the most talked about right now, and that is because it has to do with elections and voting. And that is a hot topic for obvious reasons. There's a lot happening in states, including your own state of Arizona. What the For the People Act would do, what S1 would do, is essentially set baseline standards for access to the ballot and also for election administration. So we currently have a very patchwork and discretionary system as our elections function across the country right now. The 2020 election made that painfully clear to so many Americans that may not have been aware of that. So these pro-voter reforms in S1 would mean that voters can expect a certain level of accessibility to the ballot, no matter where they live, whatever state they live in, that voting and election rules will have some degree of consistency across the board and across the nation. So our patchwork election systems as they stand and the broad discretion of states has really become a serious threat to voting rights in many areas in the nation, including Arizona, as we saw today with the passage of the 1713. And especially after the Supreme Court's Shelby ruling in 2013, which many of you have heard about, there is a real vulnerability and fragility to protecting voting rights at this point in our history. State legislatures are exploiting that discretion and passing restrictive laws, and federal action, in all honesty, may end up being the last resort for voters in many of these states. So there are a laundry list of pro-voter reforms included in this first area of reform in S1. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to emphasize that S1 would essentially nullify most of the state laws that are on the table currently that would restrict access to the ballot. So I'm just going to list a few of them that I think could be pertinent to Arizona and your situation. S1 includes provisions like exceptions to voter ID rules. If somebody does not have a photo ID, then they can, for example, agree to sign a sworn affidavit and cast their ballot. It has automatic voter registration. So when you get your driver's license renewed, or if you apply for SNAP benefits, then the default is that you are going to become a registered voter unless you opt out as an eligible person, of course. Same-day voting registration is another great provision, which would essentially allow people to show up at the polls and realize that they're not registered for whatever reason to register and still cast their ballot. And then something like 15-day early voting, we know that that is crucial to give flexibility to voters that are full-time workers or can't show up on election day, for example. No excuse, vote by mail anywhere in the nation. It means that every voter, every eligible voter needs to have access to mailing in their ballot if that is what they opt to do. And then also S1 would include clear procedures and standards for maintaining registration rolls for voters. This, I think, speaks to the bill that was passed today in Arizona, where one of our colleagues is going to talk more about. I do want to, at this point, distinguish between what is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the bill I'm speaking of, which is the For the People Act, because there can be some confusion between the two. They're both phenomenal bills and they're both necessary bills, and they are both part of our democracy reform agenda. But there are distinctions. They do different things. So the reforms that I am talking about in S1 in this sort of first area of voting and election, they were in fact crafted by John Lewis himself. But however, the Voting Rights Advancement Act that is now named after John Lewis is a distinct piece of legislation. It's equally as important, but it is moving on a separate legislative path. The VRAA is focused on protecting voting rights, specifically against racial discrimination in states with a known history of suppression. We know that that's part of our national legacy, and we need to very intentionally root that out of our democracy. The VRAA would restore the full protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that were struck down in that Shelby ruling that I mentioned earlier in 2013. So, the VRAA essentially imposes pre-clearance by the Department of Justice, not judgment, before any new election or voting rules can be adopted in those problematic states. Important to note that these voter protections would be targeted and would be forward-looking. And so the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would not apply to the state bills that are currently on the table in many states. So we voting rights advocates, we really think of the Voting Rights Advancement Act as sort of step 2 in our reform agenda, just as critical on a longer term path right now. And I want to finish off with this first area of reforms by emphasizing a critical reform that is in S1 that would essentially put an end to partisan gerrymandering, which is such a distorting dynamic in our democracy. It would be transformational in and of itself to have these reforms for the redistricting process. So now I'm gonna brush on the second area of reforms that are in the For the People Act. And these reforms are really meant to control the influence of money in politics. We know that this is an issue. If you remember, many of you do remember, in 2010 with the Citizens United ruling of the Supreme Court, they decided that money is essentially equal to speech. And short of a constitutional amendment, that decision stands. And really, so the only resort is to try to lessen the influence of that money on our politics. And S1 does that in 3 primary ways. The first one is by disclosing big donors and dark money. The second way is by creating an alternative small donor matching financing system for campaigns. And the third way is by reforming the Federal Election Commission. So even in the Citizens United ruling, Justice Scalia, of all people, admitted that the key to not having money take control of our politics was disclosure. So S1 would finally make those disclosures into law so that voters can know who's trying to influence them, and so that donors can't hide the messages and the candidates that they're supporting. Currently, the the privately funded campaigns for public servants is very problematic. I like to compare this to your firefighters. How would you feel if firefighters were funded by homeowners associations or by certain gated communities? You would just assume that that is likely going to impact what their service to different areas would look like and the quality of that service. It's no different for public servants in our government. They should not be beholden to specific parties that offer them financing. So what S1 would do is essentially allow candidates to opt out of the private financing system of big donors and super PACs, and they can instead choose to opt into an alternative system that essentially allows small donors up to $200 to have public matching funds to put towards their candidates of choice. So it's quite a powerful way to diminish the influence of money at the same time as amplifying the voices of small donors and the people. And it significantly opens up the field for candidates that wouldn't otherwise have access to wealth through their networks. These are non-traditional candidates like full-time workers, single mothers, people of color. These are the types of people that the field would be opened up for to represent the public. And voters can also know where their candidates are getting their money. Finally, with the Federal Election Commission, so S1 would substantially reform this commission. This is the agency that oversees and enforces campaign finance laws. It has essentially been out of commission for the last several years because of partisan gridlock. So it's been unable to enforce any of the laws on the books. And even as money in politics over the last 4 years has doubled, so it's growing exponentially. Between 2016 and 2020, it doubled to be $14 billion in 2020, which I can't even wrap my head around. So S1 would significantly strengthen and provide resources to this agency that has been defunct. And finally, the last area of reforms in S1 gets to the ethics provisions, which are obviously critical to providing a basic level of confidence in the people and that their elected officials are in fact serving the public. So many of the norms that we had assumed were laws and have seen them sort of thrown by the wayside over the last several years, we realized, oh, these aren't laws, these are just norms that people have abided by in the past. what S1 would essentially do is codify those norms so that they do become the law of the land. Things like presidential candidates disclosing their tax returns, or divesting problematic business interests before they take office as decision makers. Things like conflict of interest standards for policymakers that also are investing in the market. And things like reporting foreign agents that are trying to solicit influence in our elections, like we saw in 2018. So that is writ large what is included in the For the People Act. So I hope that you can see how that would be transformational and is really critical at this time. I want to talk a little bit about where we are in the process and how things are moving right now at the federal level. So the For the People Act is moving. It passed in the House. HR 1 passed in March, which was very exciting. And now it's in the Senate. In fact, this morning, we just had the markup in the Committee of Jurisdiction. It wasn't this morning, it was 9 hours long, and it was a partisan circus, I'm very sorry to say. The reality is that Republicans have shown us what we expected. The fact that they are supporting states in the kinds of laws that states are putting forth is reflected in their resistance against this bill. They will never support this bill and the reforms in this bill. And so it will have to be passed on a partisan basis, which is extremely unfortunate. So we have a narrow window of possibility right now, and it was really an unexpected gift that was given to us by Georgia with its runoff election. And Georgia also now hangs in the balance, much like Arizona does with your democracy and your representation and voting rights. Leader Schumer has said that failing is not an option, and that is true because there's just too much in the balance. We have the 2022 elections. Your own Senator Kelly is going to be up for re-election, and we know that the redistricting process is going to be in full swing later this year. And if not for this bill, it is going to be full of partisan gerrymandering that will lock things in for the next 10 years. So the primary hurdle that we are facing right now in the Senate is the filibuster, which many of you have heard about. It's a Senate procedural rule that essentially makes a supermajority necessary for most legislation to be debated even, much less voted on in the Senate. The filibuster is not based on constitutional law, and like any other Senate rules, it can be changed by the Senate. So the filibuster also, I need to say, has a very sordid history. It's racially problematic in the way that it has been used in the past to block anti-lynching legislation as well as civil rights laws. It's increasingly been abused in the last 5 to 10 years by the majority party in the Senate to block essentially any legislation from moving forward in the Senate. And we saw that with COVID, the gridlock with COVID. So in the current political climate with the partisan gridlock, it's really an untenable Senate rule that needs to be reformed. And I would say in Arizona, your Senator Kyrsten Sinema, she has in fact co-sponsored the For the People Act, which is great, meaning that she supports it in its substance. However, she's also said that she will not support reforming the filibuster and wants to seek bipartisan support on this bill. Sadly, the reality is that that is not going to happen, and that without changing the Senate filibuster rule, S1 is never going to come to a vote in the Senate, and it has no chance of becoming law. So you can see that Arizona is critical in this fight on multiple levels on getting the bill passed and on needing the bill to be passed so that your own voting rights can be protected. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Quincy, for everything that you are doing. We appreciate so much everything that you are doing. We appreciate the faithful democracy. My name is Vasu Bandhu. I have the honor to serve like a faith community coordinator for Arizona Faith Network, and also in the Dhammapada Sangha of Zen Buddhism, like a shuru. From my own experience of faith in Buddhism, I invite everyone that we can close our eyes and take 3 deep breaths. We can breathe in and breathe out. We can breathe in and breathe out. And finally, breathe in and breathe out. Thank you. I will introduce our great presenters for today. Thank you very much for being here, Ms. Hannah, Joel Edman, and Paul Rockower. Ms. Hannah is a state chair for civic engagement, NAACP chair of the Secretary of State Advisory Commission, and is chair of the African American Legislative and Leadership Group. Welcome. Joel Edman is the Executive Director of Arizona Advocacy Network. Welcome. And Paul Rockower is the Executive Director of Youth Community Relations Council. Welcome of our great panelists. I give you the microphone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashu.
And I am up to give the Jewish prayer. This is the Congregation Sheret Israel's prayer for our country. Sovereign of all worlds, preserve and protect America's democracy and bless us, the people of the United States, who have ordained and established the constitutions and laws of this great land. May you, who grants each person understanding, give us the wisdom faithfully to place in all our gates leaders who revere truth and despise corruption. Enable us and our chosen representatives to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with you, our God. Grant that we proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants thereof. Let abundance flow from the works of our hands and wisdom grow among all of the peoples of this land. Strengthen the hands of those who guard America's freedom and fill them with your spirit so that our country may ever be a light unto the nations. May this be God's will, and let us say amen. And I also want to say just a very brief prayer for peace for what's going on with the Israelis and Palestinians. Let us pray that they can reach peace as well. Thank you.
Good evening.
It's time now. We're moving into our panelist discussion, and our panelist discussion is moderated by Pastor Aubrey Barnwell. Pastor Barnwell, I think you're going to hand it off to our first questioner tonight.
That's Marie Lee Bay. And the question that we have for Marie, if I'm not mistaken, Marie, go ahead.
She may have shifted to prayer time. Are you there, Marie?
Marie, you went back on mute, my friend.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The first question is, can you give us a 1-minute reflection on what you heard from Sister Quincy and how it feels and how you feel that affects Arizona?
That question is directed toward Mel Hannah, to Joel Edman, and to Paul.
Pastor Barnwell. Pastor Barnwell, this is Mel. Could the question be repeated real quickly?
Sure. Give us a 1-minute reflection on what you heard from Sister Quincy and how you feel that affects Arizona.
Okay, this is Mel. I'm not sure what sequence we go in, but if it's all right, I'll give my response. Okay. What I heard is that the underbelly of this whole dialogue is really the survival, if you will, of democracy in this country. To me, it's that basic, it's that essential, and it's that critical. Folks have talked about, well, if we use the political process or the administrative process to get this legislation passed, what about the unforeseen problems in the future? My answer to that is that if we don't do it now, those, quote, unforeseen problems in the future will be no longer in the future. They are already starting to exist, and they will get only worse and worse. So I really see this in a very survival mode, if you will, in that if we don't do something now, if we don't flip this whole script now by those that are undermining our democracy, we will not only go back to Jim Crow days, we will go back to pre-slavery days or post-slavery days. So I just wanted to kind of share that as a very basic response in terms of why and how we should be fighting this particular fight for Senate Bill 1 and Senate and House Bill 1 and Senate Bill 4. In my opinion, they are the guardrails, if you will, of this country retaining democracy in the form that it was intended to be.
Thank you, Mr. Hanna. Joe.
Yeah, thank you, Pastor Barnwell. I completely agree with what Mel just said. It really feels like we're at a moment where we're going to go one direction or the other in terms of democracy. And with S1, the For the People Act, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, we've got a real opportunity to build, for the first time, I think, really a genuine multiracial, inclusive democracy where we try to tackle the influence of big money, corporate money in our politics, at the same time as guaranteeing a fundamental freedom to vote for all Americans. Or we can follow the path that we're seeing play out in front of us right now at our state capitol in Arizona and state capitals across the country, of removing people from democracy, right, of purposeful exclusion in terms of our ability to vote and influence what decisions are made. And I know as somebody who's advocating at the state capitol, I'm tremendously excited about the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, in large part because we are tired, those of us who are trying to hold the line every year on attacks on our democracy at the state capitol and having some protection federally, would be massive, in addition to, I think, the real tremendous advancements that are included in both bills.
Thank you, Joel. Paul.
Thank you, Pastor Barnwell. Yeah, to echo what Joel and Mel said, we're absolutely at a critical time here. Sister Quincy did such a wonderful job of taking some very heavy information and distilling it down to a very local level and how it affects us here. And really, we are at this on such a critical day where we see, direct attacks on Arizona's system of democracy. And Sister Quincy really helped enlighten us on how this would help reverse the tides of what we're facing. And as Joel said, we're really at this juncture where we need this tool to help protect the democracy from all of these inroads that have been, all these attacks on it. So I echo, what Joel and Mel said, that this is vital. And I thank Sister Quincy for giving us the broad view and then distilling it down to the local level.
Thank you, Paul. Our next question is by Vasu Bandhu, and this question is directed towards Mel and to Paul.
Thank you, Reverend. Why should people of faith care about the for the People Act.
This is Mel again, and if you don't mind, Joel, I'll give my response. Again, in terms of why people of faith should care about that, I want to go back to a document that formed this country, and in my opinion, it points exactly and precisely to the answer for that question, and that's the Declaration of Independence, where it starts off with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So to me, that sets the stage for this whole debate, if you will, that we are given a right of happiness, not a privilege, but a right of happiness by the very declaration that created this country. And where sometimes we have maybe got it twisted or undefined or ill-defined is that in a democracy, we choose to utilize a government not to select who should get these rights, not to be rewarding folks or creating criteria. The government in a democracy is created to protect these inalienable rights, period, to protect them. And in a democracy, if you don't have the right in a fluid system of self-governance, which a democracy is based on, then we have just diluted that very first opening statement of our own Declaration of Independence, when we boast that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator, not government, not the Senate, not the City Council, but endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Government is here and created to protect those rights, not to disperse them. So that's again a pretty basic answer that I kind of take my foundation from.
Thank you, sir. Paul?
Thank you, Mel, for that very eloquent answer. So I'm going to come at this from two ways. First, for the Jewish Community Relations Council and for the Jewish community, why we as the Jewish community care very deeply about this issue. So in Judaism, we are taught tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. And so really it's in pursuit of that justice that we come together and fight for this issue. I'm proud that the Jewish Community Relations Council signed on with over 90 Jewish organizations across the country in support of HR1 S1. My parent organization, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, just introduced a resolution, had a resolution on expanded voter access in support of HR1 S1. And what they said in the resolution is the cornerstone of democracy is the election process. The Jewish people have long been committed to ensuring that all eligible citizens are afforded the opportunity to vote and have their votes counted. This is what is the basis of our democratic system, and this is what we have to be here fighting for. Arizona's had a system that's been a beacon of light on how to run elections freely and fairly, and they're trying to snuff out that light with these attacks on the Arizona election laws. And as Sister Quincy pointed out, this is how we reverse this. Now, as an AFN board member, I would say that we believe that the right to vote and participate in our democracy is a core religious value of all Americans. It's a part of our civic and religious duty. And so it's incumbent upon all people of faith to band together to make sure that no voices are canceled, that no voices are lost in this process. So truly it is something that affects the Jewish community, affects all communities of faith, but we have to all stand together and support HR1 S1 and fight for this.
Thank you, Paul. Khalil Rushdan will ask the next question, and it will be directed towards Joel.
Okay, where do the dangers of voter suppression lie here in Arizona right now? And the second part of that question is, how would the passage of S1 affect what is going on in Arizona?
Thank you, Khalil. As Sister Quincy referenced earlier, we saw one of the top voter suppression bills that has been moving through this legislative session, unfortunately, pass out of the legislature and be signed by the governor earlier today. That was Senate Bill 1485, the Pebble Purge, or taking the permanent out of the permanent early voter list, so that it will now be called the active early voter list. And if a voter is not using their early ballot often enough to satisfy the rules of the bill's sponsor, they would be purged from the permanent early voter list. This would be the first time, will be the first time, if it goes into effect, that the permanent early voter list has not been permanent. In other words, that voters who were still eligible could be removed for no other reason than not, voting using an early ballot. So that unfortunately is on its way towards becoming law. A couple other bills that we're still trying to fight here at the state capitol. One, Senate Bill 1713, is a sweeping new set of barriers also for voting by mail specifically, or voting early using an early ballot. New ID barriers requiring new kinds of documents or document numbers in addition to your signature on that early ballot. We know that if that bill moves forward, it's likely to be amended. And so I'm trying to describe it in broad strokes because we know that, again, if it moves, it will take a slightly different form than it has now. And then the last one I want to reference, can't even really honestly begin to describe, but on the floor today, the deciding vote in passing that Pebble Purge bill was a senator named Kelly Townsend, who had blocked it earlier in the session, not because she was opposed to it, but for a variety of reasons, including it seems that she was trying to revive one or potentially more of her own election bills, many of which were clearly voter suppression bills that she'd introduced earlier in the session, and many of which have died during the process. Oftentimes, as we get towards the latter days of session, legislators will make these kinds of moves, make kind of power plays to bring their own ideas back. And so we don't know exactly what that could be, but there are bills that have started moving that could be used for vehicles for what we call in Arizona a striker amendment, or a strike everything, where the original bill is entirely deleted and new language is added in. So we don't know what that will be yet, unfortunately, but it seems like something is coming down the road before session ends that we'll see, maybe even potentially worse than the Pebble Purge, but don't know exactly what's coming. So, but as to how these federal protections would really intersect with that, I mentioned one, just having some federal backing would be really helpful for those of us fighting these fights here at the state level. And part of that is because you can flatly, it creates sort of bare minimums, right, of voting access. And so there would be policies that the legislature simply could not adopt that would take us below certain barriers, right? Once we had same-day registration under the For the People Act, the legislature could not take it away, right, or add new registration barriers as part of that. So having that floor would be massive. But also under the John Lewis, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, even something like the Pebble Purge, which isn't exactly contemplated, I should say, in the For the People Act. Most states don't have a permanent early voter list. We're not unique, but somewhat unique, just a handful of states that have that sort of system. So there isn't a provision around a permanent early voter list. But the Voting Rights Act, when we were covered under the Voting Rights Act as a state, whenever we were to change voting laws, would have to demonstrate to the Department of Justice that these laws will not have a disproportionate impact on voters of color. That would be very hard to demonstrate for the Pebble Purge. It would be very hard to demonstrate for other voter suppression bills that are being considered this session, because we have good data to show that they would disproportionately impact voters of color. And so having that called a pre-clearance process back in place for Arizona would be massive, again, as a backstop to prevent the worst of the worst voter suppression bills from going into law.
Thank you, Joe. The next question will come from Dr. Jana Scott.
Thank you, Pastor Aubrey. And before I ask this question, I just want to remind everybody that almost 64 years ago to the day, Dr. Martin Luther King gave a speech at the prayer pilgrimage at the Lincoln Memorial. Pastor Aubrey referenced this speech in his opening framing, but I just want to share just a couple sentences from this speech because it is eerily consistent with what we are seeing today. And it troubles my soul, some of the things that are going on. And I want to thank Sister Quincy and all of those who have spoken. But it troubles my soul that in 2021, we're dealing with the same suppression issues that Dr. King and others bled and died for. So I hope that everybody that hears this will take this time that we've had together tonight seriously and get involved. Katie's going to give us some ways later on, but just from Dr. King's speech, he said, give us the ballot and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of, in that day, an anti-lynching law. Give us the ballot and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill. And of course, he meant men at that time, but I say men from the standpoint of anthropos because generally we have men and women now. But is that what people are fearing? So give us a perspective, each and every one of you, Mel, Mr. Hannah, Paul, and Joel, what does this mean to you? Share your perspective about what not being able to pass S1 means for people of color, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans in particular, but all people of color, and really all of us, people who have disabilities, the elders who have depended on, having clear access to the vote. Give us your own perspectives on that in these closing comments. And then we'll get to the Q&A. Thank you.
This is Mel again. Very, very heavy question there, Dr. Jana Scott. I think it's the answer to that, and my answer, a partial answer to that, a very relevant question is it just reveals the underbelly of this effort. And that revelation to me is there's been a distinct decision by obviously who and what's pushing all of this to conclude that there's been a decision, or there should be a decision on who's running the show. It's a clear indication to me of not necessarily who we want running it, but it's a much clearer indication of who we don't want running it. And if I'm using running in a very generic sense. So I think that, again, the survival of democracy, as we have been led to believe, is that it's an equal setting, but when you leave equal and you selectively, by whatever process, and this one is an ugly one, conclude there's a smaller group or an elite group or a non-this group or a non-that group that in fact will control the destiny, then to me, that's the very obvious answer, Jana, to your heavy question. Some folks just feel comfortable in, quote, the good old days. And the description of the good old days is when things were not like we're trying to get to in these days. So the signal to me is very clear. And one final statement on that, the effort, the combined effort, I think there's now 42 states that are passing suppression laws and all. We know what the fight is in Washington against Senate Bill 1 and 4, and and House Bill 4. The impact of all of that is, in my opinion, a part of it is the game plan is intimidation. So if we can, whatever means possible, keep those folks from even having the desire or the trust or the credibility in the democracy, in fact, we have accomplished our goal, because if they stay home, if they don't participate, if they don't engage, then we've won. The battle is over. So that's my kind of generic answer, Jana, to your very, very heavy question. But to me, the answer points out the seriousness of it.
Thank you, Mel. How about you, Joel?
Yeah, thank you. I hesitate to follow after Mel's answer. I just want to say +1, but if I have anything to add, I think these struggles in advancing and contracting democracy have been very cyclical over the course of American history, and I think it's appropriate that the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act obviously has been named for John Lewis to remind us of the sort of last great time of advancing in the civil rights era, when we passed the original Voting Rights Act and laid the foundation for building, for the first time in American history, attempting to build a real multiracial democracy, and the backlash to that. And we saw that backlash again right on January 6th. We see that backlash in our state capitals. It's been an ongoing saga, obviously, that didn't begin in the civil rights era, but has run all throughout American history. And I feel we're now at another one of these big inflection points, where we can choose again to follow the victories of the civil rights era and deepen those victories and strengthen them for the future, and lay the foundation for a democracy that generations going forward can depend on, or it'll continue to erode. And if we want to build a democracy that's accessible to all of us, then I think we should be centering those who are the most impacted by suppression laws, right? People of color, people with disabilities, elderly, young people. Because if we can build a democracy that's accessible to the most excluded citizen in America, right, then we'll have a democracy that's accessible to all of us. And we have an opportunity to take a big step here with both the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
Thank you, Joel. Now, Paul, you've prayed for African Americans and Jews to walk together again like we did in the 60s. Bring us on home on this one, and then back to Pastor Aubrey.
Thank you, Jana. That was wonderful, what you mentioned. Yeah, the Jewish community, we will not stand idly by while there are those who seek to disenfranchise our neighbors. I'm reminded, as you mentioned with Dr. King, but also the quote of Fannie Lou Hamer, sick and tired of being sick and tired. I mean, we're sick and tired of seeing these attacks on the voting rights of people of color, of those who are disabled. And it's just, we're at a point where we have to stand up and we have to be there for one another. And no one can stand idly by when anyone's rights are being threatened. So I thank you, Jana, for sharing the Dr. King quote, and know that the Jewish community will not stand idly by while there are those who threaten to disenfranchise any of our neighbors. And we will continue to march like Rabbi Heschel did with Dr. Martin Luther King. That was then. Today we have a new fight, and we will continue that fight.
And I'll say amen. Thank you, Paul, Joel, and Mel. We have a question. The first question we have is regards to the filibuster. The question is, the way the Republicans are using or have used the filibuster should be against the rules. Why isn't it? Why isn't it? Who feels?
Would you like me to answer that one?
Sure.
I would just say that rules, as we are learning, unfortunately, are not always fair. So I completely agree with the questioner that it should be against the rules. Unfortunately, it the filibuster in and of itself is a bad rule. So it is essentially a bad rule that has gone down a slippery slope to be exploited as a worse rule at this point. So what do you do with a bad rule? We used to have a rule that said that Black Americans were 3/5 of a person. You change that rule, right? That's the option at hand, is to change that rule. So that is what is in front of us. There are many ways that the Senate could choose to either reform the filibuster or get rid of the filibuster completely so that any legislation can be passed by a simple majority in the Senate, which is what was envisioned, by the way, in the Constitution. So kudos to the questioner for observing what is a very, very true and problematic fact.
Thank you, Sister Quincy. Our next question is directed towards either Joel or Mel, I believe. Can we get enough signatures to refer the Pebble Change bill for a public vote?
I'm happy to start with this, Pastor Barnwell, because it's a question I'm getting a fair amount. And so the first, let me just back up, just make sure everybody is aware that in Arizona, we have the ability when the legislature passes a law to gather signatures and put that law on the ballot for a public vote. And in the meantime, the law does not go into effect. And I think the last time this happened was with the big voucher expansion back in 2018, what became Proposition 305. First, I think an important thing for people to know on 1485 is the good thing is it will not actually start removing voters from the permanent early voter list until 2025. So not to say that it's not a big deal. It means we've got some time to undo it and to educate voters about the impact. So one, I think one of the usual reasons to try to get the signatures at this point to put it on the ballot is to keep it from having any harm in the near term. And this bill will already not have harm in the near term. So that I think is good. Now, I have definitely heard from a lot of people interest in organizing a referendum drive. And I think that might be the right thing to do on this. I think for my own sake, I'm curious to see what else comes out of the legislature. Are we going to see, is this the beginning of a whole host of terrible bills that we'll want to refer to the ballot? Is this the last thing? And I will also mention as part of this sort of non-answer is that at Arizona Advocacy Network, we're part of coalitions that are working on proactive ballot measures, a ballot initiative to gather signatures and put actually very similar to the For the People Act, but for the state level. And in that, you could also repeal bad laws that have passed. The last version of this we attempted for 2020 before the pandemic unfortunately shut down our signature collection, included repealing some bad voter suppression bills that had passed in years prior. So there are a variety of ways. Lawsuits is another way. So there's a real possibility there will be referendum drives that kick off after this legislative session, potentially on that bill, maybe on others. It's a little early to say, but please keep your eyes open for that.
Great. The next question. What unique gifts, no, that's not the question. How can we impact redistricting? How can we impact redistricting? Sister Quincy?
I can, yeah, sure. I'd be happy to answer that one. So redistricting and partisan gerrymandering is very problematic nationwide. My understanding in Arizona is that you all actually have one of the better systems of the 50 states. And in fact, the reforms that are in the For the People Act would in many ways mimic what you all are doing. And essentially what that is setting up independent redistricting committees instead of having the legislature and those who have a clear conflict of interest in drawing their own districts, instead of having them run the process. And it also sets up sort of what the priorities should be in the redistricting process, like keeping communities of interest together and drawing geographic areas in reasonable manners, right? And maybe even according to sort of terrain that is, barriers that are in the natural terrain, for example. So Arizona, I don't think would be impacted too much by that specific reform in For the People Act, because it seems like you all are pretty well up to par on that front. However, in states like Georgia and Pennsylvania and so many others in the nation, it is extremely problematic, and it distorts the representation of the people in such a way that gives a supermajority to a party that does not have the supermajority support of the people.
Dr. Barnwell, this is Mel. Could I answer part of that question?
Sure.
On the redistricting, and as was stated, Arizona some time ago did by a vote put into this new system, independent, and keep that word in mind, redistricting commission. It's made up of 5 members. Each party submits 2 names or elects 2 folks, and then those 4 folks have to go to the independent roster and get the 5th person. So it's a 5-member commission that comes into existence through that process, which is a fairly fair process. That commission then has the responsibility of hiring staff, and they've done that, an executive director, a deputy director, et cetera. And they also hire a firm that will legally give them direction as they move forward. The watchdog part, even though, and Jana Scott is well versed in this, we were anticipating through the population for Arizona to gain an additional congressional seat. Unfortunately, that did not happen. However, Arizona did grow tremendously large from the last census. And as a result of that, redistricting will still have to occur. So I don't want us to conclude that since we aren't gaining an additional congressional seat, that concern should go away. Now that same commission will have the responsibility, just like nationally, to establish boundaries for the 9 congressional seats we have, and also our 30 state legislative districts. And as we all probably know, the criteria for that is equal population. So Arizona's growth over the last 10 years has been in a variety of ways, in a variety of locations. So our concern and our watchdog effort should be to try to ensure that we, the folks, communities of color, rural communities, et cetera, are not gerrymandered out of those newly formed districts and removed from the possibility of electing a representative of their choice. So our task is still ahead of us in this redistricting. And granted, we do have a fairly decent system. At least it's not in the hands of the legislature, but it still bears watching, very much so.
Thank you, Mel. Want to also provide, we've been provided the website for the Arizona Redistricting Commission, and it's irc.az.gov. That's irc.az.gov. And you can go to that website and find more information about meeting and what's going on in regards to the redistricting. Our next
Pastor Barnwell, again, they meet every Tuesday at 9 o'clock. So it's a live meeting. The agenda is posted. So it's an open process. So any input or concerns certainly can get to the right folks. It's just a matter of an organizational status, so to speak, so that we are helping make sure that they're operating on this basic information.
Thank you, sir. Next question is, what unique gifts or roles do you think the people of faith bring to the fight, and what is our role in the plan to win? I direct this to Paul.
That's a very good question. What unique gifts do people of faith bring to this fight? Well, I mean, obviously our belief that, this? Oh, that's a good question. You know, I am not a rabbi. I am not perhaps the best person to answer this. I'm going to pass this one back to somebody who actually is a faith. Maybe Reverend Katie wants to pick this one up. I'm not sure I have the spiritual capacities to offer what that divine gift is.
Oh, Reverend Rockower.
That's a rabbi to you.
I can answer a little bit and kick it over. I think Pastor Aubrey can answer too, circle it back to him in a minute. But, you know, community organizing has been a key to communities of faith. Communities of faith have led the efforts for social change for generations here in this country. And I think one of the things that drives us is that every week with a call to our spiritual, not just teachings, but our action. And so knowing that there is that deeper call, and we are not in a place, if we are following any of our traditions correctly, to be comfortable, right? Like our traditions call us out of that area of comfort, so that we can really understand how we anticipate and see God working in this world. And so I think our particular gifts are the fact that we have something driving us that is more than just our day-to-day. It's a spiritual kind of impact, as directing Dr. Scott just said, providing a moral compass that is just so much better than how I'm saying it right now. Dr. Scott, thank you in the chat. I really do think that we bring that gifts of calling and passion and power to this, and the history, right? So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. created these ways to organize that taught us how to bring people together of different faiths, of how to engage in a nonviolent way, of how to really speak to the issue that is at hand. And I think our voices can tend to cut through the noise. I know at Arizona Faith Network, we refuse to demonize people. And as much as we love many of our community partners, we will step away from them when they start going down that the key and heart of our traditions. We believe that everybody has the ability and the power and to change their mind, and that every single person has sacredness and holiness in them. And so we can't demonize others in order to get our opinion to win in that particular way. And so we really have to have a conversation across the aisle and across faith traditions. Pastor Aubrey?
I would ditto that. I would also say that the strength of any movement is dependent upon the unity of people, which requires some humility. Humility meaning that we are concerned more with the whole than we are our individual agendas, our own individual directions, our own individual plans, if you will. And that I think that what we have as a faith community is that is a foundation for us being communities, that we realize that it's more about the whole than it is about the individuals. And I think we live in a time where there is much more individualism, and we need the unity in order to make sure that everyone is included in the decisions that are being made. And so I think that's what we bring, is a strength of unity and connection that can only come from that begins with and starts at a place of humility.
Those were both beautiful answers. I'm really glad I passed the mic to you too.
And somebody, Mel, you have something?
Yeah, just real quick, and kind of like who you asked the question to first, I'm a little out of my lane here, but let me just add to this previous question a little bit. I've been personally pleased with seeing the faith community engagement, if you will, as I have. I've been around here a long time, some 80 plus years, and I've seen and witnessed the engagement portion from the faith community. And I guess I kind of appreciate that, because for a long time, in my earlier days, I would hear some faith community folks say, well, there's something in the Constitution that says separation of church, state and church. And I respected that comment, but later doing a little research on it, I did find out to a degree that there's really not a direct statement like that. But what I more importantly found out was that it did not mean that the church should not be engaged in the state or government. It meant that the government or the state should not be in the church, telling the church what to do. So with that kind of a foundation, I've been pleasantly pleased and watching the involvement, if you will, of the faith community, just really not only be engaged, but leading that engagement parade, as in my humble opinion, it should. I mean, if the faith community can be involved in, by design, not using the word politics, but everything is politics. If the faith community can't be engaged in the very thing that gives us substance, I don't know who else could or should.
That's good. That's good. The next question is, I think, close to that. It says so many people just don't know what is at stake with the For the People Act. How can people of faith get the word out and organize? Anyone want to take a stab at that? I actually think we are doing it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we are doing this right here.
That's what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
There are a number of things that Reverend Katie is going to share at the end, but I think that's what we're doing it, sharing it in our communities, making sure that we are sharing even this, sharing this on our pages, social media as much as we can. I believe that one of the next question was in regards to Kirsten, Senator Sinema. And that question was, if she will not vote to get rid of the filibuster, what might she vote for that would limit its use to us as to prevent these two federal acts from being approved by a simple majority? What can we learn from what Stacey Abrams accomplished in Georgia, and who will lead the effort in Arizona? I think that that's a really good question. Anyone want to take a stab at that? Because I believe that's where our focus has to be. Yes, Sister Quincy.
I can speak to the first question, not to the second question. With the first question, I think what they're getting at is, what are the other options if she's not ready to get rid of the filibuster? And there's a lot of different ways that it can be reformed. One way is that there could be, like, for example, budget and financial law can be passed by a simple majority, because reconciliation is essentially a carve out from the filibuster. And the same thing has happened with judicial nominees. That's how we've gotten the last two of them with a 51 vote Senate majority, because there was a reform that carved out that from the filibuster. The same thing could be done for democracy reform. So that's one very simple way that it could be reformed. There's also, I mentioned a slippery slope that made a bad rule worse and more exploited. The filibuster used to require people to stand on the floor and talk for hours on end, and you couldn't leave in case they had a vote. You had to be there in case there was some sneaky maneuver and they tried to have a vote when they didn't have a quorum. That could be the case again. So we could make it really hard to have a filibuster. Right now, it's gotten to the point that it's a default assumption that the minority party, nobody even has to call one officially. It's just the way things are now. So there's a lot of different areas of gray and ways that that rule can be reformed that would allow this particular legislation to pass, or these two bills related to democracy reform, which are at least as important as judicial nominees, if you ask me. And two sort of ways that it could be a 55-person vote that's needed instead of 60. So you could shave off some of what that supermajority looks like. the Senate has a lot of discretion on how this rule can and should look. So I would encourage the senator to use her imagination, if she really does support this bill, to figure out how to pass it.
I'm going to piggyback on that to the question of who's going to lead this. I'm going to read a quote by Marion Wright Edelman. A lot of people are waiting for Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi to come back, but they're gone. It's up to us, it's up to you. It's up to all of us on here tonight, all of us who are paying attention, all of us who are organizing and leading. You know, this is who's going to lead in Arizona. We are. It's up to us.
This is Mel. I would agree with that. And on the filibuster and our two senators, I know there are options and alternatives, but if we're really fighting for democracy, and I don't know why they can't grasp that on this one issue, the voting rights legislation. We're not talking about the DC voting rights and the other bills that the president wants to do. For this one critically important saves democracy adjustment to the filibuster, I think the question and the only answer in my mind acceptable to our two senators is, do you support SR1, HR 1 and Senate 1 and HR 4? And if your answer is yes, then you got to also say, I'm endorsing a mechanism to adjust the filibuster. Because if you don't, it won't happen. It simply will not happen. So I don't think we don't need to let them off the hook, in my humble opinion. They got to know that's a firm position by Arizona. And we know that Senator Kelly is up for election, so maybe that's a little uneasy for him. Senator Sinema has a few more years, but I can't think of a heavier question where the answer is so critically important to so many people in the country that we allow them, either one of them, to get off the hook.
Thank you. Anyone else? The next question is sort of connected, I think, connected to the last one in this regards, that the individual faith communities, do the individual faith communities view democracy as an action, or has it become just synonymous with a title? How do the individual faith communities address or look at or perspective on democracy?
I can speak to the Catholic tradition. When we think of democracy, Catholic social justice tells us that we are called to be active participants in the democratic process. And that is because we are also called to bring about the new creation, right? We need to be actively engaged in whatever systems are at hand in our society to improve them, to make them more just, to protect the vulnerable, to bring about basic rights for all humans and equality. And so if our democracy is the system that we work within, then that is the system that we need to be engaged in. I would also ask that, not ask, but sort of say that the idea that there is a collective wisdom that comes out of many voices being heard, the sort of idea of the body of Christ coming to fruition, that is key, I think, to just the vision of what democracy is and the sort of redemptive spirit of democracy that is what has made America great and is what has enabled our country to improve the way that it has, even with all of the sordid past and unjust systems that we've had to try to work our way out of.
I'd like to thank you, Sister Quincy. I would like to press Mel a little bit on something that he just stated that I think is connected to this. You just stated that we should not let our senators off the hook, that we should put the pressure on them. What does that mean, and what does that mean for us as a faith community, and what does that look like?
Well, to be real blunt, what it means to me is that Senator Sinema, Senator Kelly, are you going to endorse an adjustment for the voter rights legislation so that it can be sent as a bill to the president to sign. To me, it's that basic. And I don't think there's any, I can't think of any higher priority or issue that can be expressed to our elected United States senators than that at this point in time. I mean, everything else just really falls underneath that. If we don't do it, all the work we're talking about doing here with the 30-some bills in the other states across the country, that's going to only increase with varied degrees of success and time that's going to take and effort, and we're piecemealing it. So I just see I don't see how our two U.S. senators cannot acknowledge the seriousness of this and the impact of it, and be willing to take a firm position on the one way that I see to have this legislation go forward and become law for the land. So I'm just being very direct about it, and I think sometimes we have to be that, and then let the cards fall where they may.
Thank you. Are there any other faith communities who would like to share on that question?
I'll just very quickly say that, I mean, in Judaism, we consider, the democratic process to be something sacred, and we pray that, we will be able to continue to strengthen it. And it's just a fundamental tenet of our faith that, society is truly strengthened when our democracy works well. And the Jewish community has faced lots of persecution over centuries, millennia. The safest we are is when we have a functioning civil society, and when we have a functioning civil society, it's because our democracy works. And so it's, we pray for that our democracy will continue to work as it should, and we will fight for it because we have no other choice.
Thank you.
I'll piggyback on that a little bit too, that I think I come out of a pretty progressive Protestant tradition of Christianity. And so we've always had social justice at the core of who we are. But for my understanding of my faith and the intersection of democracy is that our faith teaches us how we're supposed to be in community and with in the world. And the democratic process also puts rules and regulations around how we're supposed to be and with one another and behave too. And so I don't see how you separate that in some ways. And that's not to say there isn't a need for the separation of church and state. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that I think we have to be active through our faith traditions in the democratic process.
Thank you. I'd like to, I'd like to speak on behalf of AACCC, which are a number of denominations. But what I would say in regards to our view on democracy is the efforts that we have put towards making sure that we are in connection with those who are elected. So we push to right. We actually advocate for bills. We actually spend time with legislators, investing money and time, and really, for the most part, most of us are communicating with our congregations on the responsibilities that we have as citizens to actually exercise our right to vote. So I think that would be our view of democracy, is that we actually push and encourage and inspire our faith community to actually participate in the actions. Okay.
We're about right on time. And so we're moving into our call to actions time together. And so I want to really thank you, Pastor Aubrey, for facilitating tonight and helping guide the conversation and all of our panelists, Paul from the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Phoenix, Sister Quincy Howard from Network, Joel Edman from Arizona Advocacy Network, I always have to spell it out, and Mel Hanna from the NAACP of Arizona. So thank you so much for being with us. And before I dive into a very specific call to actions for the Arizona Faith Network and the toolkit we created with AACCC and Network, I'm going to invite Joel to give a call to action for Arizona Advocacy Network.
Thank you. And thank you all really for the time tonight and allowing me to speak about the struggle for our democracy in Arizona and across the country. I mentioned that there are still some bills that could be moving here in the last few weeks and months of the legislative session. And I'm going to drop in the chat a link to get email updates from us at AZAN, not just about what's moving at the legislature and opportunities to weigh in, but also about all of our work in the democracy sphere, including work we're doing now around rights restoration, around policies for voting in county jails, the ballot measure that I mentioned, and a variety of other stuff. So to follow our work and also updates on what is moving on democracy in our legislative session, you can sign up there. Thank you so much. And again, thank you all for having me.
Right, thank you, Joel. I'm going to drop a link in the chat too, and have you all, if you are able, if you are at a computer or somewhere near a web browser, if you go to Arizona Faith Network /act now, and it's not hyperlinking for some reason, you will be led to the toolkit that was put together by the African American Christian Clergy Coalition and the Arizona Faith Network. And that toolkit has all of the information for what I'm about to share in terms of our follow-up action steps. So once you go to arizonafaithnetwork.org/act now, you'll be prompted to press a button and it will pull up the PDF of everything I am about to say. So our first action item tonight is to ask you to contact our Senators Kelly and Sinema with the phone number that we dropped in the chat, and let them know that first you support the For the People Act and you're really concerned about what's going on here in Arizona, and let them know why you care. If it's from your faith tradition, if it's from your community, what is moving you to be here tonight, and talk about the filibuster that has to be addressed to with them. We also invite you, if you are a faith leader in your tradition, to go ahead and sign the faith community letter that is going to Senators Kelly and Sinema, showing leadership in passing S1 and requesting them to do that. That link I will get to you in just a moment. That is a Google Doc link, so it's a little long there. But we've already had over 100+ faith leaders sign this in Arizona. So we definitely, if you have not signed this quite yet, go ahead and add your name there. And also there's a rally to end the filibuster that is coming up. That is on May 20th, dropping that link in the chat as well. That's going to be at Hance Park, I believe. And so there are a ton of groups that—
Space Park, Katie, Civic Space Park.
Thank you for that correction, Dr. Scott. Civic Space Park, and that will give you the Facebook event, and then there's some other links that'll take you there too, but we definitely invite you to come down and meet the other folks and other organizations that are working really hard to end the filibuster and get this passed as well. Tomorrow morning, there is a press conference that is going to be happening in response to everything that happened today with voting rights here in Arizona. That's going to be at 9 a.m. in the Rose Garden at the Capitol. We invite you, if you want to come to that press conference, to come and stand in solidarity at 8:45 tomorrow morning. So those are the action items we are leaving with today, but I do want to point out that if you are interested in receiving updates, and I highly encourage you do this, to text CJRAZ to 52886, and that will subscribe you to the African American Christian Clergy Coalition's criminal justice reform text string. I'm on it. It's great, the information they push out. I definitely recommend staying connected there. And you absolutely, if you go to ArizonaFaithNetwork.org and you sign up for our newsletter, I'm dropping that link right now, that will keep you connected to us at AFN as well. That was a lot to say, but it's all in the toolkit. And I'm going to bring Dr. Scott on screen with me too, and just really, really thank her for all of her hard work. We know she is a legend in Arizona with her organizing. Oh, you are. And pulling all this together tonight. And Sister Quincy Howard, the great, great work that network is doing in mobilizing us from DC and helping inform us here. So again, thank you to our panelists and everyone else. And Dr. Scott, any final parting words?
Yeah, I just want to really bring attention to the energy and the effort that Sister Quincy, Faithful Democracy, and Public Citizen has put. They don't need to care about Arizona, but they do care. And we are so grateful that it was kind of a fluke that I met Sister Quincy. I'll have to tell the story sometime, but it was really a divine appointment. And because of that, Katie and I and all of you have been blessed to be able to get educated on what does it mean to reform the filibuster? Why is that important? And I saw somebody in the chat say that Kelly and Sinema both say they support S1, but I hope you heard over and over and over tonight, supporting it is not enough. We've got to get them to take action to reform the filibuster so that these types of laws can be passed and so that our voting rights can be preserved. So Sister Quincy, you've been a phenomenal educator to us all, and we want to thank you. And thanks to Arizona Faith Network. As I said early on, the premier organization for both ecumenical and interfaith work in the state of Arizona. We're very grateful to you, Reverend Katie. So I'll turn it back to you if there's a closing prayer or comments. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Scott. We are just a few moments over. So I think for tonight, I'm just going to remind us that when we feel overwhelmed, today was a pretty heavy day in terms of voter rights and voting suppression here in Arizona, to do what Vasu told us to do, to just take a breath and stop and remember you are connected to something that is bigger than you, as Pastor Aubrey said, that there are people out there working for justice with you. And so let us continue to walk hand in hand, step in step, just working for justice and for everyone's voice to matter. So thank you so much for being here tonight. This is recorded and we will send around an evaluation with the recorded link for you to share or rewatch if you want to. So know that our prayers, our blessings are with you as you move forward through tonight. Good night, everyone.
Good night.